The ongoing fight between abortion restriction and access, Mike Hilgers and a group of attorneys general signed a letter against the Department of Health and Human Services rule that supports reproductive health care privacy. The rule would essentially ban the sharing of information about abortions across state lines. Proponents say the proposed federal rule change would mean that Nebraska wouldn't be able to acquire or use that health privacy information against women for investigations or civil suits. Hilgers said, quote, "Our comment letter protects the status quo and the federal-state balance of power. The Biden administration's proposed rule is based on the false premise that states want to treat women as criminals and punish medical personnel who provide life-saving care," end quote.